brother passed away and left a ranch in my name. When my family, who had abandoned me 8 years ago, found out, they knocked on my door. "Hi, father-in-law. We came to live in the master suite. You can keep the barn," my daughter-in-law said. At that moment, I stood my ground and said 3 words. That froze them. "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The phone rang at 7:43 in the morning on a Tuesday, cutting through the silence of my cramped studio apartment like a blade. I'd been up since 5:30, same as every day for the past 8 years, making instant coffee and staring out at the parking lot of the Sunrise Manor complex where I'd been living since my world fell apart. I almost didn't answer. The only calls I got were from bill collectors or the occasional wrong number. But something made me reach for that old flip phone, the one Marcus had mocked mercilessly before he kicked me out of what used to be my own home. "Alan Whitmore?" The voice was professional, distant. Speaking. "This is James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I'm calling regarding your brother, Alan Whitmore." My stomach dropped. Alan and I hadn't spoken much lately, maybe a Christmas card here and there, but he was the only family member who hadn't completely written me off 8 years ago when everything went to hell. "What about Alan? I'm sorry to inform you that your brother passed away 3 days ago. Heart attack. He was found in his study at the ranch." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the threadbare armchair I'd bought at a garage sale, the one with the broken spring that poked through the cushion. Alan, gone, just like that. "Sir, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here. I know this is difficult, but I need to discuss his will with you. You're listed as the primary beneficiary." I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. There must be some mistake. Alan barely knew me anymore. "No mistake, sir. You've inherited the entire ranch property, 230 acres, the main house and all buildings. I'll need you to come to my office to sign the paperwork." After I hung up, I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been growing bigger each month. Alan's ranch. I remembered visiting there as kids, running through those endless fields while our parents argued in the kitchen. Back when family meant something different. 8 years ago, I thought family meant everything. I thought when you hit bottom, the people who shared your blood would catch you. I was 52, had worked for the same construction company for 23 years, and then the recession hit. Layoffs came fast and brutal. One day I had a job, a house, respect. The next day, I was standing in my son Marcus's living room, hat in hand, asking if I could stay in their guest room until I got back on my feet. "Dad, this is really awkward," Marcus had said, not even looking at me. He was 31 then, married to Sandra for 5 years, with 2 kids I thought I'd help raise. I'd been so proud of him, my successful son with his fancy house in the suburbs, and his wife who always dressed like she was going to a business meeting. Sandra appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression already decided. "Alan, we've talked about this. We have our own family to think about. The kids' college funds, our mortgage. We can't take on additional responsibilities right now." Additional responsibilities. That's what I'd become to my own son. "It would just be temporary," I'd said, hating how my voice sounded small, defeated. "Just until I find something." Marcus finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was embarrassment. "Dad, you're 62. 52. You're 52, and you've got nothing saved, no backup plan. How is that our problem?" Sandra stepped forward, her voice taking on that tone she used when explaining things to slow children. "We've worked very hard to build our life here. We can't risk our family's stability because you didn't plan properly." I wanted to remind them about all the times I'd helped them, the down payment I'd given them for their house, $20,000 from my retirement fund, the weeks I'd spent babysitting when the kids were small so Sandra could go back to work. The countless weekends I'd fixed things around their house, painted rooms, built the deck where they entertained their friends, but standing there in their perfect living room, surrounded by family photos that somehow all seemed to exclude me, I realized that none of that mattered. I wasn't their father anymore. I was their failure. "There's a motel on Highway 67, Sandra had said, already walking toward the front door. "Clean rooms, reasonable weekly rates." That was 8 years ago. I never saw the inside of their house again. Now, sitting in my studio apartment with the lawyer's words echoing in my head, I tried to process what this inheritance meant. Alan's ranch was worth more than I'd made in the last 8 years combined. It was a place where I could finally stop running, stop scrambling, stop feeling like I was one missed payment away from sleeping in my car. But even as hope tried to take root in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was too good to be true. In my experience, when life handed you something valuable, it usually came with a price you hadn't counted on. I was about to find out exactly what that price would be. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to drive out to Alan's ranch. 3 weeks of paperwork, lawyers, and sleepless nights wondering if I was making the right choice. The place was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Rolling hills stretching to the horizon, a sturdy 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and outbuildings that spoke of a life well lived. I'd been staying in the main house for exactly 4 days when the sound of car engines broke the morning silence. I looked out the kitchen window and felt my stomach drop. A silver SUV and a red pickup truck were pulling into the gravel driveway, kicking up dust clouds in their wake. Marcus stepped out of the SUV first, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt like he was heading to a country club. Then Sandra emerged from the passenger side, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the 2-hour drive from the city. Behind them, their kids, Emma, now 16, and Tyler, 14, climbed out looking bored and slightly hostile. My hands shook as I set down my coffee cup. 8 years. 8 years of silence, and now they were here. I opened the front door before they could knock, standing on the porch like a sentry. Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable, but Sandra's smile was bright and predatory. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice carrying that forced enthusiasm people use when they're trying to convince themselves they're doing the right thing. "You look good. Really good." I didn't respond. Sandra stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wooden porch steps. She was carrying a large purse and had the look of someone who'd already decided how this conversation would go. "Alan, we were so sorry to hear about Alan," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy she'd never felt. "We would have come to the funeral, but we didn't know until afterward." That was a lie. Alan's obituary had been in the paper, and I knew Sandra read the obituaries religiously, always looking for networking opportunities or gossip. "What do you want?" I asked. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, that's not. We came because we're family. We should have been here for you during this difficult time. Where were you 8 years ago when I needed family?" Sandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Alan, I know there were some misunderstandings in the past, but that's behind us now. We're here to help." I looked at Emma and Tyler, my grandchildren who'd grown into strangers. Emma was on her phone, typing rapidly, while Tyler kicked at the gravel with his expensive sneakers. They didn't remember me. Why would they? They'd been 8 and 6 when their parents decided I wasn't worth keeping around. "Help with what?" I asked. Sandra gestured broadly at the ranch. "This is a lot for one person to manage. And honestly, Alan, at your age, living out here alone, it's not safe. What if something happens to you?" Marcus jumped in, eager to support his wife's argument. "She's right, Dad. This place is huge. We've been talking, and we think the best solution is for us to move out here with you. Share the responsibilities." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Share the responsibilities." "Exactly," Sandra said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We can take the master suite upstairs. It's perfect for our family. You can have the guest room, or—" She paused, looking around with barely concealed calculation. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the converted apartment above the barn. It's got its own entrance, very private. The barn. They wanted to stick me in the barn like an unwanted animal." "We've already talked to the kids about changing schools," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "Tyler's excited about the idea of living on a ranch, aren't you, son?" Tyler looked up from his phone long enough to shrug. "I guess." Emma finally spoke, her voice carrying the entitled whine I remembered from when she was small. "Do we really have to live here? There's like nothing to do, and the Wi-Fi probably sucks." "It's temporary," Sandra said quickly, shooting her daughter a warning look. "Just until we get everything sorted out." Everything sorted out. I knew what that meant. They'd move in, take over, and gradually push me out of my own inherited home. I'd become the hired help on my own property. "No," I said. Sandra blinked. "Excuse me?" I said no, you're not moving in. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushing. "Dad, be reasonable. We're trying to help you here. The same way you helped me 8 years ago. Sandra's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating hardness underneath. Alan, I think you're being a bit unfair. We were in a difficult position then. We had young children to think about, and now you have older children who need college funds, I said. Funny how your difficult positions always seem to involve my money. That's not what this is about, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sandra put her hand on Marcus's arm, a subtle signal I'd seen her use 100 times to control conversations. Perhaps we should discuss this inside, like civilized adults. There's nothing to discuss. You need to leave. Sandra's smile became razor sharp. Alan, I don't think you understand the situation. This ranch is worth quite a bit of money. Property taxes alone must be eating through whatever savings you have left, and the maintenance costs. She shook her head sympathetically. You can't possibly afford this on your own. That's my problem. It becomes our problem when you lose the place and come begging for help again, Sandra said, her voice dropping its pretense of warmth. At least this way, we can keep it in the family. Keep it in the family. As if they'd ever considered me family when it mattered. Marcus looked genuinely distressed now, caught between his wife's ambitions and whatever fatherly feelings he might still harbor. Dad, just think about it. We could make this work. We could be a family again. For a moment, I wavered. The loneliness of the past 8 years pressed down on me like a weight. These were my grandchildren, my only son. Maybe Sandra was right. Maybe I couldn't handle this place alone. Then I looked at Sandra's face and saw the triumph there, the certainty that she'd already won. She was already mentally redecorating the master bedroom, already planning how to squeeze me out. Get off my property, I said quietly. Sandra's eyes flashed. You'll regret this, Alan, when you're sitting alone in this big empty house, wondering why your family doesn't visit. Remember that you chose this. They piled back into their vehicles, but as Marcus's SUV reached the end of the driveway, it stopped. I watched him get out and walk back toward the house. He came alone this time, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Dad, he said when he reached the porch, I'm sorry about everything. About 8 years ago, about today. Sandra gets ideas in her head and sometimes I just go along with them. He nodded, looking more like the little boy I used to teach how to throw a baseball than the successful man he'd become. She found out about the inheritance from Cousin Robert. She's been planning this for weeks. Of course she had. Sandra had probably started planning the moment she heard Alan had died. I can't keep doing this, Marcus. I can't keep pretending that what happened didn't matter. I know, I hoped maybe we could fix things. Some things stay broken, son. He stood there for a long moment, looking like he wanted to say something else. Finally, he just nodded and walked back to his car. As I watched them drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years, the satisfaction of standing my ground. But I also knew this wasn't over. Sandra wasn't the type to give up after one rejection, especially when this much money was involved. I was right to be worried. The first letter was tucked inside Alan's desk drawer, sealed in an envelope with my name written in his familiar handwriting. I'd been going through his papers for a week, trying to understand the ranch's finances and operations, when I found it wedged behind a stack of insurance documents. Alan, it began, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've inherited more than just property. You've inherited a responsibility I couldn't fulfill myself, protecting you from the vultures who only circle when they smell something worth taking. My hands trembled as I continued reading. Alan had known. Somehow he'd known exactly what would happen when Marcus and Sandra found out about the inheritance. I've watched from a distance for 8 years, brother. I know what they did to you, and I know they'll try to do it again. That's why I've taken certain precautions. The second letter was in the barn, hidden inside an old coffee can on the highest shelf. Finding it felt like a treasure hunt Alan had designed specifically for me. This one was longer, more detailed, and it contained information that made my blood run cold. Alan had documented everything. He'd hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Marcus and Sandra's finances. The glossy lifestyle they'd been flaunting was built on credit cards and loans. Their house was mortgaged to the hilt. Marcus's business was failing, and Sandra had been maxing out credit cards to maintain their appearances. They're drowning, Alan, and they see you as their life preserver. Don't let them pull you under with them. But it was the third letter, hidden in a safety deposit box whose key Alan had left with his lawyer, that revealed the true scope of his planning. Inside was a will amendment that hadn't been filed with the court, a codicil that detailed specific conditions for the inheritance. I sat in the lawyer's office reading the document with growing amazement. Alan had anticipated every move Sandra might make. "Mr. Whitmore," the lawyer said, "your brother was very specific about these conditions. The ranch property cannot be subdivided or sold for a period of 5 years. During that time, you must reside in the main house alone. No family members may establish residence on the property without violating the terms of the inheritance. What happens if I violate the terms? The property reverts to the state as a nature preserve. Your family gets nothing." Alan had effectively made it impossible for Marcus and Sandra to move in, while ensuring I couldn't be pressured into selling and splitting the proceeds with them. It was brilliant, and it was exactly the kind of protective gesture I should have expected from my brother. But Alan's precautions went even further. He'd established a trust fund that would cover the ranch's operating expenses, property taxes, and maintenance for the next 10 years. He'd also left detailed instructions for ranch management, including contacts for reliable workers and neighboring ranchers who could provide advice. The final surprise was in a sealed envelope marked "Open only if they come back." They came back on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after their first visit. This time, Sandra arrived with reinforcements, her parents, Howard and Patricia Kellerman, along with Marcus's sister Beth, whom I hadn't seen since her wedding 15 years ago. I watched from the kitchen window as they arranged themselves in formation. Sandra directed the group like a general positioning troops for battle. Howard carried a briefcase, Patricia had a camera, and Beth looked uncomfortable but determined. Sandra knocked on the front door with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. When I opened it, she was wearing a black dress and her most sympathetic expression. "Alan, we need to talk, as a family. My family is dead and buried next to Alan in Greenwood Cemetery." Howard stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Now see here, young man. That's no way to talk to your daughter-in-law." I almost laughed. At 60 years old, I hadn't been called young man in decades. Sandra isn't my daughter-in-law. She made that clear 8 years ago. Patricia began taking pictures of the ranch house, the outbuildings, and even me standing on the porch. "For the insurance assessment," she explained when I stared at her. "What insurance assessment?" Sandra's smile was predatory. "Alan, we've been doing some research. This property requires significant liability coverage, especially if you're living here alone. One accident, one fall, one incident, and you could lose everything to a lawsuit." Beth finally spoke, her voice tentative. "Dad, maybe we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately," I said. "This is my property, and I want all of you off it." Howard opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "We've consulted with several attorneys, Alan. There are grounds for contesting Alan's will, particularly given your relationship with your son's family. A court might find it unreasonable for a man of your age to manage such a large property alone. Are you threatening me?" "We're offering you a partnership," Sandra said smoothly. "We move in, share the responsibilities and the expenses, and everyone benefits. Otherwise." She shrugged. "Well, legal battles are expensive and exhausting. At your age, is that really what you want?" I looked at Marcus, who'd remained silent throughout this entire performance. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but he wasn't stopping his wife. He was just letting it happen, the same way he'd let it happen 8 years ago. That's when I remembered Alan's final envelope. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to get something." I left them standing on the porch and went to Alan's study, where I'd hidden the envelope in the same coffee can where I'd found the second letter. My hands were steady as I broke the seal and read Alan's final message. "Alan, if they're pushing legal action, show them the photographs. If they're threatening you financially, show them the bank statements. If they're claiming you're incompetent to manage the property, show them the medical evaluation. I've given you everything you need to fight back. Use it." Inside the envelope were copies of the private investigator's report, including photographs of Sandra at expensive restaurants and shopping centers, while Marcus's business was supposedly struggling. There were bank statements showing cash advances from multiple credit cards and documentation of 3 different loans they'd taken out using their house as collateral. But the most damaging evidence was a recording the investigator had made of Sandra at a coffee shop, talking to a friend about her plans for the ranch. "The old man's probably going senile anyway." Sandra's voice was clear on the recording. "Once we get him declared incompetent, we can take control of everything. That ranch has got to be worth at least $2 million. We could subdivide it, sell off parcels, make enough to pay off all our debts, and still have plenty left over." I walked back to the porch holding the folder Alan had prepared. Sandra was in the middle of explaining how they could convert the barn into a second residence when I interrupted her. "Sandra, how's Marcus's business doing these days?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. It's doing fine. Why?" "Really?" "Because according to these financial records, you've borrowed against your house 3 times in the past 2 years. And these credit card statements show you're carrying over $40,000 in debt." The color drained from Sandra's face. Howard stepped forward. "Where did you get those?" "Alan hired a private investigator. He was very thorough." I pulled out the photographs. "Here's Sandra at Le Bernardin last month having lunch with her sister. The bill was $347. And here she is at Nordstrom, buying a handbag that costs more than my monthly rent used to." Marcus stared at the photos, his face growing pale. "Sandra, you told me you were meeting with clients." "I was networking," Sandra said quickly. "Business expenses. Business expenses for a company that's hemorrhaging money?" I pulled out the final piece of evidence. "Would you like to hear what Sandra really thinks about our family reconciliation?" I pressed play on the small recorder Alan had left with the evidence. Sandra's voice filled the air, her words about declaring me incompetent and subdividing the ranch hanging in the silence like a death sentence. Beth gasped. Patricia stopped taking pictures. Howard closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. Marcus looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete betrayal mixed with dawning understanding. "You planned this," he said quietly. "You've been planning this since the day we found out about the inheritance." Sandra's composure finally cracked. "Marcus, I can explain." "Explain what? How you've been lying to me for weeks? How you've been spending money we don't have while our son's college fund sits empty?" "We needed this, Marcus. We need this ranch." "No," I said quietly. "You wanted this ranch. There's a difference." The family meeting dissolved into chaos. Howard and Patricia hurried to their car, unwilling to be associated with Sandra's exposed scheme. Beth mumbled an apology and followed them. Marcus stood on my porch, staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. 8 years, he said finally. 8 years you've been telling me Dad was the problem, that he was irresponsible, that he made his own bed." "He did make his own bed," Sandra snapped, her mask completely gone now. "He lost his job, lost his house, came crawling to us for help. We had every right to protect our family." "Our family," Marcus repeated. "What about his family? What about the fact that he's my father?" Sandra's laugh was bitter. "Your father is a loser, Marcus. He always has been. The only reason we're even here is because his brother took pity on him." That was the moment I saw something break in Marcus's face. Whatever hold Sandra had maintained over him for the past 8 years finally snapped. "Get in the car," he told her. "Marcus, get in the car, Sandra. We're leaving. As they drove away, I noticed Marcus wasn't following Sandra's vehicle. They were going in opposite directions, and somehow I knew they wouldn't be arriving at the same destination. Alan had given me more than a ranch. He'd given me the tools to fight back and the strength to use them. Marcus called me 3 days later. I was sitting on Alan's porch watching the sunset over the pasture when my old flip phone rang. For a moment I considered not answering. The past few weeks had been peaceful, and I wasn't sure I was ready to let the chaos back in. "Dad?" His voice was raw, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. "Marcus, can I come see you? Alone this time. Sandra's staying at her mother's house." I almost said no. After everything that had happened, after all the years of silence and rejection, the safe thing would have been to maintain my distance. But something in his voice reminded me of the little boy who used to help me fix things in the garage, who'd bring me coffee on Saturday mornings while I worked on projects around the house. "All right, but just you." He arrived an hour later in a pickup truck I didn't recognize, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled. When he climbed the porch steps, I could see the weight of the past few days in his shoulders. "New truck?" I asked. "Rental. Sandra took the SUV when she left." He settled into the chair beside me, staring out at the fields. She cleaned out our checking account too. $12,000. Gone. I didn't respond. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound like, "I told you so." "I've been thinking about that recording," Marcus continued. "About what she said. About you being senile. About taking control of the ranch. The worst part is, I knew she was planning something. I knew it. And I went along with it anyway." "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake 8 years ago. It was easier than facing what we'd done to you." The cicadas were starting their evening chorus, filling the silence between us. I remembered summer evenings like this when Marcus was young, before Sandra, before everything got complicated. We used to sit on the porch of our old house and talk about everything and nothing. "She's been controlling everything for years, Dad. What I wear, where we go, who we associate with. She convinced me that cutting you off was protecting our family, that you were a bad influence on the kids. And you believed her. I wanted to believe her. Because if she was right, then I wasn't the son who abandoned his father when he needed help most." I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw how much the past 8 years had aged him. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tiredness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" "I don't know." His voice broke slightly. "Forgiveness, maybe? A chance to fix this? Some things can't be fixed." "I know, but maybe we could start over, build something new." I thought about Alan's letters, about the conditions of the inheritance, about the years of loneliness and struggle. But I also thought about the grandchildren I'd missed watching grow up, about the son I'd loved despite everything. "Sandra won't let that happen," I said finally. "Sandra's gone. She filed for divorce yesterday. Turns out she's been having an affair with her personal trainer for the past 6 months. She took the kids to her mother's house and hired a lawyer who specializes in taking men for everything they're worth." I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because Sandra's true nature had finally been exposed. Sadness because I could see how much it was destroying Marcus. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You tried to warn me years ago, remember? When we first got engaged, you pulled me aside and said something felt off about her. I got angry, told you to mind your own business." I did remember. Marcus had been 26, head over heels in love with a woman who seemed too perfect, too polished, too calculating. But he was an adult, and I'd learned to keep my opinions to myself. "The kids blame me," Marcus continued. "Emma won't even talk to me. Tyler just stares at me like I'm a stranger, and maybe I am. Maybe I've been a stranger to everyone, including myself." We sat in silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. I found myself thinking about Alan, about the conversations we'd had over the years about family, about responsibility, about the difference between being a father and being a parent. "There's something else," Marcus said. "The business is bankrupt. Has been for months. Sandra knew, but she kept spending anyway. I've got about 6 weeks before I lose the house. What will you do?" "I don't know. Find an apartment somewhere, I guess. Try to rebuild from nothing, again." The irony wasn't lost on me. 8 years ago, I'd been in exactly the same position, and Marcus had turned me away. Now he was facing the same uncertain future, the same humiliation of starting over in middle age. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, and I know you probably hate me, but is there any chance? Could I maybe stay here for a while? I can work, help with the ranch. I don't need much space. The barn apartment, or even just a couch. I don't have anywhere else to go." There it was, the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating since the day I inherited the ranch. My son, finally understanding what it felt like to have nowhere to turn, asking for the same help I'd once asked of him. The old Alan, the one who'd been beaten down by years of rejection and loneliness, wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto this chance for reconciliation, even if it meant risking everything Alan had worked to protect. But the new Alan, the one who'd learned to value his own worth, knew it wasn't that simple. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. This ranch, this inheritance, it's not just property. It's my future, my security, my peace of mind. Alan left it to me with specific conditions, and one of those conditions is that I live here alone." Marcus nodded, his face falling. "I understand. I'm not finished." Those conditions exist for 5 years. After that, I can make my own decisions about the property. But right now, if I let you stay here, I risk losing everything. I wouldn't ask you to do that, wouldn't you? What happens in 6 weeks when you lose the house? What happens when Sandra's lawyer comes after you for alimony and child support? What happens when you're desperate and the only asset your family has access to is this ranch? Marcus flinched as if I'd hit him. You think I'd try to take it from you? I think you're in a desperate situation, and desperate people make desperate choices. 8 years ago, you chose your wife's security over your father's well-being. What makes you think you won't make a similar choice again? Because I've learned from my mistakes. Have you? Or are you just facing consequences you can't avoid anymore? The question hung in the air between us. Marcus stared out at the darkening landscape, his hands clenched in his lap. You're right, he said finally. You're absolutely right. I chose Sandra over you, over what was right, because it was easier. Because she made me feel like I was protecting my family instead of abandoning it. And now I know the difference. Now I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that choice. I studied my son's face in the dim light from the porch fixture. He looked broken, genuinely remorseful. But I'd seen genuine remorse before. I'd felt it myself after I lost my job, after I lost my house, after I realized how completely I'd failed to prepare for disaster. Marcus, I want to help you. Despite everything, you're still my son. But I can't risk the ranch. It's all I have left. I know, I understand. But there might be another way. Marcus looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. There's a cabin about 20 miles from here, on the other side of town. It belongs to a rancher named Bill Henderson. His son moved to California last year and the place has been sitting empty. Bill mentioned he's looking for someone to house sit, maybe do some maintenance work in exchange for rent. You'd call him, put in a word for me. I'd consider it. But Marcus, this isn't charity. This isn't me rescuing you because you're family. This is me giving you information about a legitimate opportunity. What you do with it is up to you. Marcus nodded, understanding the distinction. What would I need to do? Prove that you've changed. Not with words, but with actions. Get a job, any job. Start paying down your debts. Show me that you're capable of taking responsibility for your own life instead of looking for someone else to fix your problems. And if I do that, then maybe in 5 years when the inheritance conditions expire, we can talk about what kind of relationship we want to have. But Marcus, I need you to understand, this isn't a guarantee. This isn't a promise that everything will go back to the way it was before. Too much has happened for that. I understand. Do you? Because in 5 years, you'll still be the son who abandoned his father. I'll still be the father who watched his family choose money over loyalty. We can build something new, but we can't rebuild what was broken. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Finally, he stood up, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that reminded me of the determined little boy he'd once been. Can I call you in a few days? Let you know how things go with the cabin? You can call. But Marcus, if you contact me again asking for money, or a place to stay, or anything other than a conversation between two adults trying to figure out if they can be part of each other's lives, this ends, permanently. I understand. As I watched him drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Cautious hope mixed with realistic expectations. Maybe Marcus had learned something from hitting bottom. Maybe Sandra's betrayal had finally shown him the price of choosing security over integrity. Or maybe he was just desperate enough to say anything he thought I wanted to hear. Time would tell which version of my son was real. Marcus got the job at Henderson's place. He called me a week later to let me know, his voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination I hadn't heard since he was young. It's not much, he said. Maintenance work, fence repair, feeding cattle. Bill's paying me enough to cover basic expenses and start chipping away at the debt. How are you holding up? It's honest work, hard work. I'd forgotten what that felt like. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in 8 years. He told me about the cabin, about learning to cook for himself, about the silence that came with living alone. He didn't ask for anything, didn't hint around for money or favors. It was just a son calling his father, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. That hope grew over the following months. Marcus called every few weeks, always brief conversations about work, weather, small victories and setbacks. He'd gotten a second job at the feed store in town. He'd started attending meetings for divorced fathers. He was slowly, methodically, rebuilding his life from the ground up. Meanwhile, Sandra had remarried her personal trainer and moved to Phoenix with my grandchildren. Marcus saw them twice that first year, brief visits that left him hollow-eyed and quiet. But he kept working, kept paying his debts, kept proving that he could survive on his own. It was during one of our phone calls, about 8 months after that confrontation on the porch, that Marcus mentioned something that caught my attention. "Dad, have you ever been up to the north pasture, the area past the big oak grove?" "A few times." "Why?" "I was helping Bill move some cattle yesterday and we went past your property line. There's a structure up there, looks like an old house. Bill said he thought Alan might have owned more land than just the main ranch." After Marcus hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I'd missed. Alan had been meticulous about documenting everything else. Why wouldn't he have mentioned additional property? The next morning I drove up to the north pasture, following a barely visible dirt road that wound through the oak grove Marcus had mentioned. The landscape here was different, wilder, with rolling hills covered in native grass and scattered clusters of mesquite trees. And there, nestled in a valley about 2 miles from the main house, was a small stone cottage. It was beautiful in its simplicity: rough-hewn limestone walls, a metal roof weathered to a soft gray, windows that caught the morning light like jewels, a covered porch stretched across the front, and mature oak trees provided natural shade. The whole place had an air of peaceful isolation that made my chest tight with unexpected emotion. The front door was unlocked. Inside, I found a single large room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder. The furniture was simple but well made: a leather armchair by the fireplace, a wooden table and chairs, built-in bookshelves lined with volumes on ranching, philosophy, and poetry. On the table was another envelope with my name on it. "Alan," Alan's letter began, "if you found this place, then you're starting to understand the true scope of what I've left you. This cottage sits on 50 acres that are legally separate from the main ranch property. Different deed, different conditions, different inheritance rules." My hands shook as I continued reading. "I bought this land 15 years ago as a retreat, a place to come when the world got too complicated. But I've always intended it for you. Unlike the main ranch, this property has no restrictions. You can do whatever you want with it. Live here, rent it out, sell it, give it away. It's yours, free and clear." But that wasn't the biggest surprise. Alan had hidden one final revelation in a folder tucked behind the books on philosophy. "I've been watching Marcus struggle this past year," the letter continued. "I know you've been talking to him, and I know you're trying to decide whether to trust him again. This cottage might be the answer to both your problems." Inside the folder were architectural plans for expanding the cottage into a small retreat center. Alan had consulted with contractors, gotten cost estimates, even applied for preliminary permits. His vision was detailed and thoughtful: 6 small cabins scattered around the main cottage, a common area for meals and gatherings, walking trails through the surrounding hills. "I've left enough money in a separate trust to fund the construction," Alan's notes explained. "The cottage could become a retreat for older men who've lost their families, their homes, their sense of purpose. Men like you were 8 years ago. Men like Marcus might be now." I sat in that peaceful cottage for hours, reading through Alan's plans and trying to process what he'd envisioned. My brother had seen something I hadn't, a way to turn our shared experience of abandonment into something that could help others. But more than that, he'd given me a choice. I could keep the cottage as my private retreat, or I could use it to build something larger. And if I chose to build, I'd need help managing the project. That evening, I called Marcus. "How would you feel about a career change?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I found something today, something Alan left behind, and I think I might have a proposition for you." 3 days later, Marcus drove up to the cottage. I'd waited for him on the porch, watching as his face changed from curiosity to amazement as he took in the setting. "Dad, this place is incredible. How long has it been here?" "Alan built it 15 years ago. He left it to me, along with plans for something bigger." I showed him the architectural drawings, the business plan, the trust fund Alan had established. Marcus studied everything with the same careful attention he'd once given to his failed business ventures, but this time there was something different in his approach. Less desperation, more genuine interest. "A retreat center," he said finally, "for men who've lost everything. Men like us." Marcus looked up from the plans, meeting my eyes. "Men like us," he repeated. Dad, this is exactly what I needed 8 years ago. A place to go, work to do, people who understood what I was going through. The question is whether you'd be interested in helping me build it. As an employee, as a partner. Alan left enough money to fund construction, but I'd need someone to manage the project. Someone who understands what it's like to start over, what these men would be facing. Marcus set down the plans, his expression serious. What would that mean? Partnership. It would mean you'd have a real stake in the retreat's success. A percentage of any profits, decision-making authority, a legitimate role in something meaningful. But Marcus, it would also mean proving you can handle responsibility without family pressure, without someone else making the decisions for you, and the conditions on the main ranch. Those stay in place for 4 more years. The cottage property is separate, legally and financially. But Marcus, if we do this together, we do it as business partners, not as father and son trying to fix our relationship through work. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the hills surrounding the cottage. I'd want to modify some of these plans, he said finally. Add a workshop area, maybe space for group counseling, and I think we should include some kind of job training component. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about what I would have needed, what I still need, honestly. He turned back to me. Dad, I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise this will fix everything between us, but I can promise I'll work harder on this than I've ever worked on anything in my life. Why? Because for the first time in years, I have a chance to build something instead of just trying to save what's already broken. I looked at my son, seeing not the desperate man who'd asked for shelter 6 months ago, but someone who'd learned to value honest work and second chances. Someone who might actually be capable of helping other men find their way back from the edge. All right, I said, let's build something. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since he was a boy. When do we start? We start by you proving you can finish what you've already started. Keep the job with Henderson until the retreat's ready for construction. Show me you can see a commitment through even when something better comes along. How long will that take? The permits will take 6 months minimum. Construction could take a year after that. Are you willing to wait? Marcus nodded without hesitation. I've waited 8 years to have a real conversation with my father. I can wait another 1.5 years to build something meaningful with him. As we walked back to our vehicles, Marcus stopped and turned to look at the cottage one more time. Dad, what made Alan think of this? The retreat center idea. I thought about Alan's letters, about his years of watching from a distance, about the careful way he'd planned every aspect of my inheritance. I think he understood something about second chances that it took me too long to learn. What's that? That they're not about going back to who you were before. They're about becoming who you were meant to be all along. We shook hands in the fading light, and for the first time in 8 years, it felt like I was shaking hands with my son. 2 years later, I stood on the porch of the main cottage watching the sun rise over what had become the Whitmore Retreat Center. 6 small cabins dotted the hillside, each one designed to house 2 men who needed time and space to rebuild their lives. The common building where we shared meals and held evening discussions was already full of morning sounds. Coffee brewing, quiet conversations, the comfortable rhythm of men who'd found their footing again. Marcus emerged from the workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands. At 45, he looked healthier than he had in years, his face weathered from outdoor work but peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. The retreat had been good for him, giving him purpose beyond just surviving. Morning, Dad. Frank and Robert are finishing up their furniture projects today. Both of them have job interviews lined up for next week. Frank was a 62-year-old machinist whose wife had left him after 30 years of marriage, taking their house and most of their savings. Robert was 57, a former accountant who'd lost everything in his partner's embezzlement scheme. They'd both arrived at the retreat broken and bitter, but 6 months of honest work and community had given them back their sense of worth. How are they feeling about the interviews? Nervous but ready. Frank's got an offer from the machine shop in town, and Robert's been working with the county on their bookkeeping system. Both of them want to stay local. That was something we'd discovered over the past year. Men who found stability at the retreat often wanted to remain in the area. We'd helped 7 men transition back into independent living, and 5 of them had stayed within 50 miles of the center. They'd formed their own informal support network, meeting for coffee every Saturday morning in town. Any word from social services about the state inspection? They'll be here Thursday, but I'm not worried. We've exceeded their requirements for housing, counseling, and job placement assistance. The retreat had evolved beyond Alan's original vision. What started as a simple sanctuary had become a comprehensive program for men rebuilding their lives after family dissolution, job loss, or financial disaster. We partnered with local businesses for job training, worked with counselors who specialized in men's mental health issues, and maintained strict but fair guidelines for residents. Men could stay up to 1 year, during which time they were expected to work either at the retreat or in town, participate in group counseling sessions, and develop realistic plans for independent living. We didn't accept men with serious substance abuse problems or violent histories, but for those who qualified, we offered something invaluable: time to heal without the pressure of immediate crisis. Dad, there's something I want to discuss with you. Marcus rarely called me Dad anymore. Most of the time it was Alan or partner, reflecting the professional relationship we'd built. When he used Dad, it usually meant something personal. What's on your mind? Emma's graduating high school in June. She wants to come visit. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. My granddaughter was 18 now, a young woman I barely knew. Sandra had remarried quickly and moved the children to Phoenix, where Emma had finished growing up without any contact with our side of the family. What changed her mind? Marcus smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. She and Sandra have been fighting a lot. Emma's starting to ask questions about why she never sees her father's family, why Sandra speaks about us the way she does. She's planning to attend college in Texas next fall, and she wants to understand her history before she moves back. What about Tyler? He's still pretty influenced by Sandra and her new husband. But Emma's always been more independent, more willing to think for herself. I thought about the bright, curious 8-year-old Emma had been before Sandra erased me from her life. I wondered what kind of young woman she'd become, whether she'd inherited the best qualities of both her parents or had been shaped too much by Sandra's manipulative worldview. How do you feel about her visiting? Terrified, Marcus admitted. I've been a weekend father for 2 years, trying to rebuild a relationship with kids who barely know me. Emma's been polite but distant. This could be our chance to really connect, or it could be the end of any relationship we might have. And you want her to come here. I want her to see what we've built. I want her to understand that the man who made such terrible choices 8 years ago isn't the same person who's been working to make amends ever since. I understood what Marcus was really asking. He wanted Emma to see him in the context of meaningful work, surrounded by evidence that he'd changed. He wanted her to meet me not as the grandfather who'd been erased from her life, but as someone who'd built something worthwhile from the ashes of family destruction. What if she doesn't like what she sees? What if she thinks we're running some kind of charity operation for failures? Then at least she'll know the truth instead of whatever version Sandra's been telling her. That afternoon, I found myself thinking about family as I walked the trails we'd cut through the hills around the retreat. The word meant something different now than it had 8 years ago when I was standing homeless in Marcus's living room. Family wasn't just about blood relationships or shared histories. It was about people who chose to show up for each other, who did the hard work of maintaining connections even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. The men at the retreat had taught me that. Frank and Robert, who'd become unlikely friends despite their 30-year age difference. Carlos, the former restaurant manager who'd lost everything in a divorce and now helped other residents develop budgets and financial plans. Jim, the carpenter who'd arrived suicidal and desperate and now led our woodworking program with quiet pride. They'd all been abandoned by their families in one way or another, but they'd chosen to build new relationships based on mutual respect and shared experience. They'd taught me that family could be something you created rather than something you inherited. Emma arrived on a Thursday evening in June, driving a small car her mother had bought her for graduation. She was tall like Marcus, with Sandra's blonde hair, but something in her eyes that reminded me of my own mother. A sharp intelligence combined with careful assessment of everything around her. Marcus introduced us awkwardly, unsure how to navigate the relationship between his daughter and the grandfather she'd been taught to forget. Emma, this is your grandfather, Alan. She shook my hand politely, her grip firm but reserved. It's nice to meet you, sir. Sir, not Grandpa, not even Alan, not even... The formality was like a wall between us, and I understood that earning anything more would require patience and proof. "Welcome to the retreat," I said. "Your father's told me a lot about you. Congratulations on graduating." "Thank you. This place is bigger than I expected." Marcus gave her a tour of the facilities, explaining our programs and introducing her to some of the residents. I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of judgment or dismissal, but what I saw instead was curiosity. She asked thoughtful questions about funding, about success rates, about how we screened applicants. At dinner, she sat between Marcus and me, listening as the evening discussion unfolded. Thursday nights were reserved for men who were preparing to leave the retreat, sharing their experiences and offering advice to newer residents. Frank spoke about the humiliation of moving in with his sister after his divorce, about feeling like a failure at 62. "This place gave me time to remember who I was before everything fell apart," he said. "Not who I was as somebody's husband or father, but who I was as a man." Robert talked about the shame of financial ruin, about losing friends who couldn't handle being around someone who'd fallen so far so fast. "The hardest part wasn't losing the money," he said. "It was losing the respect that came with financial stability. Here, you earn respect through different things: showing up, doing your work, helping other guys when they're struggling." After dinner, Emma helped with cleanup, working quietly alongside men who could have been her grandfather's contemporaries. I noticed how naturally she interacted with them, asking about their projects, remembering names and details from the dinner conversation. Later, as we sat on the cottage porch, she finally spoke about what she'd observed. "Mom always said you and Dad were selfish, that you abandoned your responsibilities to the family." Marcus stiffened, but I motioned for him to let her continue. "But watching tonight, listening to those men, they're not selfish. They're men who got knocked down and are trying to get back up. That's not the same thing as being irresponsible." "What do you think happened 8 years ago?" I asked gently. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring out at the hills. "I think everyone made choices based on fear instead of love, and I think some people found ways to learn from those choices, while others just kept making the same mistakes." Over the next 3 days, Emma threw herself into life at the retreat. She helped in the workshop, joined hiking groups, even participated in one of our evening discussions about rebuilding relationships after major life changes. The residents adopted her like a mascot, proud to show off their projects and progress to someone young enough to be impressed by their resilience. On her last morning, she found me in the garden behind the cottage, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal. "Grandpa," she said, using the word for the first time, "can I ask you something?" My throat tightened at the sound of that word. "Of course." "Do you think Dad and I can have a real relationship? Not just the polite visits and phone calls, but something genuine?" I set down the basket of tomatoes and looked at this young woman who carried pieces of all of us. Marcus's thoughtfulness, Sandra's directness, my mother's sharp intelligence. "I think your father has spent 2 years learning how to be the man he always had the potential to be. Whether you can build a relationship with that man depends on whether you're both willing to start fresh instead of trying to repair something that was broken before you were old enough to understand it. And what about you and me? What about us? I missed having a grandfather. I missed having someone who remembered Dad as a little boy, who could tell me stories about our family history. Mom tried to erase all of that, but I never stopped wondering. I felt something warm and unexpected settle in my chest. I missed having a granddaughter. I missed watching you grow up, being part of your life, seeing who you'd become. Could we try to build something new?" I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures I'd taken around the retreat. Sunrise over the hills, the workshop filled with finished furniture projects, residents celebrating job placements and new apartments. This place taught me that the best relationships aren't about going back to what was. They're about building something that never existed before. Emma smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her. I'd like that. As I watched her drive away that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my world fell apart 8 years ago. Unconditional hope for the future. Not hope based on expecting others to change, but hope based on knowing that people could choose to become better versions of themselves. Marcus joined me on the porch as Emma's car disappeared around the bend. "Think she'll come back?" he asked. "I think she's already planning her next visit." "Dad," Marcus said, using the word thoughtfully, deliberately. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become the father she deserves. You did the work, son. I just gave you the space to do it." That evening, as I made my rounds through the retreat, checking on residents and securing buildings for the night, I thought about Alan's letters, about his vision for what this place could become. He'd imagined a sanctuary for broken men, a place where they could rebuild their sense of purpose and dignity. But what we'd actually created was something even more valuable, a place where people could learn that being knocked down wasn't the same as being defeated, that losing everything didn't mean you'd lost your worth, and that family could be something you chose to build rather than something you inherited by accident. The retreat was full now, with a waiting list of men who needed what we offered. Marcus and I had plans to expand, to add more cabins and program options. But more than that, we'd built something neither of us could have created alone, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that second chances were earned, not given. 8 years ago, I'd stood in my son's living room, homeless and humiliated, learning that family could be conditional and cruel. Now I stood in a place I'd built with my own hands, surrounded by men who'd chosen to support each other through their worst moments, understanding that family could also be unconditional and healing. Alan had given me more than a ranch and a cottage. He'd given me the opportunity to discover that losing everything could be the beginning of finding what really mattered. As I turned off the lights and headed home to the main ranch house, I smiled at the thought of Emma's next visit, of the relationship Marcus and I were still building, of the men who would arrive next month looking for hope and finding community instead. Some stories don't end with dramatic victories or perfect reconciliations. Some stories end with the quiet satisfaction of work well done, relationships carefully tended, and the knowledge that you've built something worth keeping. This was one of those stories. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.